The gun was already cocked when Sheriff Zacharias Lorne rode to the edge of Dustfall, and every man in that crowd knew it. There were 30 of them, maybe more, fanned out across the main road with lanterns swinging and rifles raised, and they had one woman standing in the center of it all with her wrists bound behind her back, and her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She stood straight. That was the first thing Zacharias noticed. Despite the rope, despite the bruise forming beneath her left eye, despite the fact that the man holding the other end of her tether was Hector Grail, the most dangerous cattle baron in 4 counties, she stood straight as a church pillar, and she looked at Zacharias with eyes that held not a single drop of fear. He brought his horse to a stop at the edge of the crowd, and the silence that fell over Dustfall was the kind that pressed against a man's chest like a stone. Hector Grail stepped forward. He was a big man, red-faced and silver-haired, with a coat that cost more than most families in this town earned in a year. He had a smile that never once touched his eyes, and tonight that smile was in full, terrible bloom. "Sheriff," Hector said, drawing the title out long and slow like it was something he was tasting. "I appreciate you riding out. This woman broke into my property, stole documented papers belonging to my estate, and assaulted 2 of my hired men. I want her held and I want her tried. It is a straightforward matter of the law." Zacharias looked at the woman. She looked back at him. Something passed between them in that look. Something that had roots going back 6 years, to a burned house on the Cimarron River, to a courthouse in Abilene, to a night so dark and so cold that neither of them had believed they would survive it. He dismounted slowly. He walked through the crowd with his hand resting at his hip, not on the gun, but near enough that every man in the crowd felt the implication. He stopped 3 feet from Hector Grail, and he let the silence stretch until it was almost painful. Then he said it. "She is my wife." And that changes everything. The crowd broke into noise. Men shouted. Hector Grail's smile collapsed into something ugly and flat. The woman at the end of the rope lifted her chin just slightly, and in her dark eyes, Zacharias saw something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but something deeper and more complicated than either. He had not seen Miriam Voss in 3 years. He had not spoken her name aloud in 2. And now she was standing in the middle of Dustfall, Kansas, bound and bruised, and he had just done the one thing that could not be undone. He had claimed her. And claiming her meant he was hers to destroy. 6 years earlier, the town of Dustfall did not yet have a sheriff. It had a preacher who drank too much and a telegraph operator who cheated at cards and a general store that sold watered-down molasses as premium grade. And it had the ever-present shadow of Hector Grail's cattle empire stretching over the plains to the east. What it did not have was order. What it did not have was law. Zacharias Lorne arrived in 1878 from Abilene, where he had spent 4 years deputying under a man named Cassius Ford, who had taught him that the law was not a thing you inherited or were given but a thing you built, day by day, one difficult choice at a time. He was 28 years old when he rode into Dustfall, broad-shouldered and lean-faced with gray eyes that had already seen more violence than most men see in a lifetime. And he carried with him a commission from the county and a reputation that had preceded him by at least 2 weeks. The people of Dustfall were cautious. They had learned to be. He took the sheriff's office on the north end of Main Street and spent his first week doing nothing but walking. He walked every road, every alley, every dry creek bed behind the livery stable. He learned the town the way a man learns a hand of cards, looking for the tells, looking for what was hidden beneath what was shown. What he found was a town that was afraid of Hector Grail. Hector Grail owned the land on the eastern border and the western border and the land to the south, where the good grazing was, and he had been buying up parcels quietly for 3 years with money that no one could quite account for. His cattle operation employed half the working men in the county, and the other half depended on business from those men. He had not broken the law outright, not in any way that a court could easily address, but he had bent it and shaped it and made it serve him until the law and Hector Grail's interests had become nearly indistinguishable. Zacharias understood this on his first week. By his second week, he understood that untangling it would take years. He settled in. He was in the general store in his third week when Miriam Voss walked through the door. She was 25 years old, dark-haired and serious-faced, carrying a list in one hand and a determination in the set of her jaw that suggested she was not a woman who second-guessed herself often. She was wearing a plain brown dress and practical boots, and she had the kind of self-possessed stillness that made a room rearrange itself around her without her appearing to notice. She handed her list to the store owner, a nervous little man named Percy Finch, and while she waited she turned and found Zacharias watching her. She did not look away. She looked at him with direct, evaluating eyes, and then she said, "You are the new sheriff." It was not a question. "I am," he said. "My name is Miriam Voss. I run the schoolhouse on Cotter Road. I want you to know that I have been waiting for a functioning law presence in this town for 2 years, and I have a list of incidents that I believe warrant official attention." She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded piece of paper. "When you have time." He took the paper. He looked at it. It was 3 pages, densely written in a clear, precise hand, documenting dates and names and amounts and incidents going back 26 months. He looked up at her. "Have you been compiling this the entire time?" he asked. "Someone had to," she said. He read the whole document that night by lantern light, and by morning he had already begun to understand that the most important person in Dustfall was not Hector Grail. It was the schoolteacher on Cotter Road who had been quietly watching and recording everything while the rest of the town looked the other way. He went back to the general store the following Tuesday, not because he needed supplies, but because she had mentioned in passing that she shopped on Tuesdays. She was there. She noticed that he had come specifically to find her, and she did not pretend otherwise. She simply said, "I have more information if you want it," and they sat at the table by the window while Percy Finch watched them with nervous eyes, and she told him everything she had observed about Hector Grail's operations over the past 2 years. She was precise and methodical and utterly without sentimentality about any of it. She described what she had seen and what she had concluded, and where her conclusions were solid and where they were speculative, and she maintained the distinction clearly throughout. It was the most useful hour Zacharias had spent since arriving in Dustfall. When they were done, he asked if she would like to walk to the end of the street and back, because the afternoon was clear, and he was not ready to stop talking to her yet. She agreed, with the faint air of someone who had already anticipated the invitation. That was how it started. Over the following months, Zacharias built his understanding of Dustfall the way an engineer builds a bridge, one careful beam at a time. Miriam was his most reliable source of information, but she became something more than that before either of them had quite intended it. She had come to Dustfall from Missouri, following a teaching position that had been the only opportunity available to her after her father's farm had failed, and her older brother had moved the family west. The brother had died of fever 18 months after their arrival, leaving Miriam alone in a small house on Cotter Road with a modest salary, and a town that looked at a young, unmarried woman and either did not see her or saw her wrongly. Zacharias saw her. He saw her patience and her sharpness, and the way her face changed when she talked about her students, the particular softness that came into her expression when she described a child who had struggled with reading and then suddenly, one morning, had understood it. He saw the way she held her own counsel in public, and the way she was different in private, warmer and drier and more openly funny than she ever allowed herself to be in town. And he saw the loneliness that she carried like a practical garment, without complaint but without quite being able to set it down. He had his own loneliness. He had been carrying it since Abilene, since a woman named Clara who had not wanted a lawman's life and had been absolutely right to say so, since a brother lost to a stupid gunfight 3 years before that. He did not talk about these things easily, but Miriam had a way of asking questions that did not feel like extraction. She asked things as though she genuinely wanted to understand, not to accumulate, and he found himself answering her in ways he had not answered anyone in years. By autumn of 1878, they were the subject of considerable conversation in Dustfall. By winter, they were spending 2 evenings a week together at the schoolhouse or at the small parlor of his office, talking about everything and nothing and the future shape of Dustfall's law in roughly equal measure. By the time the snow came off the ground in March of 1879, Zacharias had come to the understanding that he was in love with Miriam Voss, and that this fact was both the simplest and the most complicated thing that had ever happened to him. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday, because that was their day in the general store, in the aisle between the flour and the molasses, while Percy Finch made a great show of rearranging cans of beans at the far end of the room. He did not go down on one knee. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. He simply looked at her and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life in conversation with you. I want to build something with you here in this town. I want to be your husband if you will have me." She looked at him for a long moment. "You should know," she said, "that I am not easy. I have opinions about nearly everything, and I do not surrender them gracefully." "I know that," he said, "and I am not going to stop my work. Whatever happens, the school stays, and so does my involvement with the legal situation we have discussed." "I know that too," he said, "and I am serious about the last name," she said. "I will keep Voss." "You can keep whatever you like," he said, "as long as you say yes." She said yes. They married in April of 1879 in the small church on Maple Street, with Percy Finch and the telegraph operator and 4 of Miriam's students' parents as witnesses. And it was quiet and quick and absolutely right. And when Zacharias put the ring on her finger and looked at her face, he felt the loneliness he had been carrying rearrange itself into something new, something lighter, something that had room in it for another person. The first year of their marriage was the best year of his life. He knew that even while he was living it, which was a rare enough thing. They built a routine and a home and a partnership that extended far beyond the domestic. Miriam continued her records and her observations, and Zacharias continued building the legal case against Hector Grail's operations. And they talked about everything over dinner and over the long evenings when the town was quiet, and the plains outside their windows were dark and enormous. He had never known this kind of intimacy before, the kind that lived in the daily fabric of a shared life rather than in grand gestures, the kind that showed itself in the way she left a lamp on when he came in late, and in the way he always remembered which tea she preferred, and in the way they could sit in silence for an hour and feel more connected than most people do in an hour of constant conversation. He loved her. He loved her with the full, particular force of a man who had waited a long time to find the right person and had not quite believed the right person was going to appear. The trouble arrived in February of 1880. It arrived in the form of a man named Douglas Wren, who rode into Dustfall from the east with a letter of introduction from the Grail estate and the job title of land agent. Wren was slender and precise, and dressed in clothes too fine for a land agent, and he moved through Dustfall with the careful economy of a man who was being paid to be dangerous. Miriam noticed him immediately. She noticed the way he visited the county records office 4 times in his first week, and the way he met twice with the judge in Abilene who handled property disputes, and the way he rode the northern property lines of 3 farms that Hector Grayle had been attempting to purchase for 2 years without success. She brought her observations to Zacharias on the 3rd evening after Wren's arrival, laid out in her careful, systematic way. "He is preparing something," she said. "Something legal, or at least something dressed up as legal. There are 3 families on the northern border who have refused to sell. I think Wren is here to find a way to make the sale happen without their consent." Zacharias agreed with her assessment. He began watching Wren. What neither of them understood yet was that Wren was also watching them. In March of 1880, a fire started in the middle of the night at the property belonging to the Callaway family, who owned the northernmost farm on the contested border and had been the most vocal in their refusal to sell to Grayle. The fire took the barn and half the house before it was contained. No one was killed, but the family's seed stock was destroyed, and they were left without shelter in early spring. Zacharias investigated. He found signs of accelerant at the origin point, and he documented everything and sent a report to the county marshal's office. Hector Grayle expressed deep and theatrical sympathy for the Callaway family, and within 24 hours made an offer to purchase the ruined property, citing the family's obvious need to relocate at a price that was barely 1/3 of the land's value. The Callaways, with nowhere to go and nothing to sustain them, accepted. Zacharias sent a second report to the county marshal. The county marshal sent back a brief letter acknowledging receipt and nothing else. Miriam was furious in the contained, absolute way she had with fury, which was quieter and more dangerous than most people's rage. She sat at their kitchen table that night with her papers spread around her and said, "The county marshal is on his payroll. I have suspected it for months. We need to go to the territorial level. We need evidence first," Zacharias said. "Real evidence, not documented observations as good as yours are, something physical, something tied directly to Grayle." "Then we need to find it," she said. "We will," he said, "but carefully. Wren is here for a reason, and that reason is to watch for exactly this. If we move too fast, we will lose whatever advantage we have." She accepted this with the particular grace she had for accepting things she disagreed with, but could not argue against logically. 2 months later, she stopped accepting it. He understood why afterward. He understood that she had seen something, some connection, some thread that had resolved the picture for her in a way she had not been able to make him see, and that she had made the decision that she could not wait any longer and that she would act on it herself. He understood all of that. What he could not understand, what he would spend 3 years not understanding, was why she had not told him. On a Tuesday evening in May of 1880, while Zacharias was riding the east pasture border in response to a reported dispute between 2 farmers, Miriam went to the Grayle estate. She went alone, in the early dark, carrying nothing but her purpose and the particular brand of quiet courage that had always been the most alarming thing about her. She was looking for the deed records. She had established, through 2 years of careful cross-referencing, that several of the property transfers in Grayle's portfolio showed signatures that did not match the documented handwriting of the supposed signatories, and that if the original deed documents at the estate could be compared to the county copies, the forgery would be undeniable and inarguable. All she needed was access to those documents. She found them. She got into the estate office through a window on the western side that Wren had forgotten to latch, and she found the deed records in a locked cabinet, whose lock she defeated with a hairpin and patience. And she spent 40 minutes documenting what she found in the dense, careful handwriting that was as much a part of her as her dark eyes or her voice. She was almost to the window when Hector Grail's men found her. There were 4 of them, and they had not been gentle about the arrest. Zacharias rode back into Dustfall at 9 in the evening and found a message waiting at his office. His wife was being held by Hector Grail pending law enforcement action, and if the law would not act then, Grail would see to matters himself. The nature of that threat was not ambiguous. He gathered what he needed and rode for the Grail estate, and then stopped himself, because going to the estate would accomplish nothing. Grail had 30 armed men on that property, and Zacharias was one sheriff with a reputation but not an army, and riding in guns drawn would get him killed and Miriam nothing. He went back to town, and he thought. He spent 2 hours that night doing what Miriam had trained him to do. He assembled the information he had, he looked at it honestly, and he formulated the approach that was most likely to work. In the morning, he sent telegrams to 3 places. The county marshal's office, which he expected would accomplish nothing. The territorial marshal's office in Topeka, which he had some limited reason to hope would accomplish something eventually, though not in time to help Miriam. And to a friend named George Alcott in Abilene, a lawyer of some ability and considerable courage, who had worked cases against powerful men before and won. Then he went to the edge of town and he waited, because Grail had not moved against Miriam yet, and that meant he was waiting for something, and what he was waiting for was a response from Zacharias that would tell him how much pressure was required. Zacharias would not give him that response. He waited, and while he waited he reviewed everything in his mind, every conversation, every document, every observation Miriam had shared with him over 2 years, and he built the complete picture of what she had found at the estate and why it mattered. On the second evening, Hector Grail brought Miriam to town. He brought her to the edge of Dustfall in chains, with 30 armed men behind him, and the crowd that gathered was everything he had intended it to be. Large and frightened and fully aware that the most powerful man in 4 counties was not going to be denied. Except that Zacharias had been waiting for exactly this. He rode out from the shadows at the edge of town where he had been watching, and he dismounted with the deliberate patience of a man who was not afraid of the noise around him, and he walked through the crowd with his hand near his hip, and he stopped 3 feet from Hector Grail and he said, "She is my wife." And that changes everything. The crowd went loud. Grail's eyes went flat and cold. "Sheriff," Grail said, and now his voice had lost the performance of it and was simply hard. "What your wife is a thief and a trespasser. What your wife being your wife means in terms of the law is nothing. The law applies to everyone." "You are correct," Zacharias said. "The law applies to everyone." He reached into his coat and produced a document folded twice. He held it up. "This is a warrant," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Signed yesterday by Judge Warren Talley of the Territorial Court in Topeka. Not the county level, the territorial level. And it authorizes the search and seizure of property and documents at the Hector Grail estate in connection with an ongoing investigation into land fraud, deed forgery, and arson. The warrant also specifies that any persons held at the estate or by agents of the estate in connection with this matter are to be released immediately into the custody of this office." Silence. Real silence. The kind that sat down hard. Grail stared at the document. "You have been watched for 3 years, Zacharias said, quieter now, just for Grail. Everything your wife did, everything Wren did, everything your men did to the Callaway farm, it is all documented. It has been for months. What your land agent did not know, because my wife is considerably better at keeping secrets than your men are at watching for them, is that copies of all of that documentation have been sitting in the territorial marshal's office since February. Grail's face went through several colors in quick succession. "Release her," Zacharias said. For a long moment no one moved. Then Grail nodded once, a sharp controlled motion, and the man holding Miriam's tether cut the rope. Zacharias walked to her and she walked to him, and he untied the remaining rope around her wrists with careful, deliberate hands. And when her hands were free, she did not collapse against him or weep, or show the crowd any of what she was feeling. She simply stood beside him with her chin level and her eyes clear, and that was exactly who she was. He took off his coat and put it around her shoulders. The crowd began to break up, the way a crowd will when the drama has resolved and there is nothing left to watch. Grail was still standing in the road, and the flatness in his eyes had gone to something that Zacharias recognized as a man beginning to calculate the next move. "We are not done," Grail said. "No," Zacharias agreed. "We are not, but we will be." He put his hand at Miriam's back, and they walked back into Dustfall together. He had thought, in the long months of her absence, that seeing her again would feel straightforward, that the love he had carried for her, unchanged and stubborn, would simply recognize her and close the distance between them like water finding its level. He had not anticipated the complexity of what he actually felt when they were inside, and the door was closed and they were finally, privately, together. She sat in the chair by the window and he poured water from the pitcher on the desk and he brought it to her, and she took it and drank it and then looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "You did not know I was here," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," he said. "I found out 48 hours ago." "How?" George Alcott. He heard it from a man in the county clerk's office who had seen Wren filing paperwork for the arrest. She nodded slowly. The silence between them had a different texture now than it used to. It had been 3 years. He had not sought a divorce, had not moved to dissolve what was between them legally, because doing so would have required him to know that she was never coming back, and he had not been able to arrive at that certainty. He did not know, until this moment, whether she had wanted that certainty. "Where have you been?" he asked. It was the question he had been carrying for 3 years, and it came out quieter than he had intended, more open to the pain underneath it. She looked at her hands. "Newton," she said. "Then Dodge City for 8 months. Then a small town in the Colorado Territory that does not have a name anyone outside of it would recognize." "Why?" he asked. "Miriam, why did you not tell me what you were going to do that night? Why did you run?" She was quiet for a moment, and he saw something moving behind her eyes, something she was wrestling with. "I was afraid," she said, and the words came out with the particular difficulty of words that have been held in for too long. "Not of Grail. I was afraid of what would happen to you." Grail had already made 2 separate overtures to men who had influence over the county commission, the commission that approves your position. "If I had told you what I was planning to do that night, you would have stopped me. And if you had stopped me, we would have kept waiting and the Callaway family would not have been the last one. There would have been another fire, another family." "So you protected me," he said. "I tried to," she said, "and I ruined everything doing it." "You did not ruin everything," he said. "I left you," she said, "without a word, for 3 years. You thought Grail's men would find you," he said. "You thought staying would put me in the middle." "Yes," she said, "but that does not make it the right choice." He sat down across from her. The lamp between them gave the room a warm, unsteady light, and outside he could hear dustfall settling into its nighttime sounds, the distant horse at the livery, the faint voices from the hotel 2 blocks down. "You should have trusted me," he said. "Not to stop you, to help you. To be beside you in it." "I know," she said. "That is what being married means," he said. "That is all it means. You do not carry the dangerous things alone." "I know," she said again, and this time it was almost a whisper. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It had shed some of its weight. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. She looked at him. "Your house," she said, "if that is still my house." "It has always been your house," he said. "Nothing in it has changed." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw all of it move across her face, the relief and the grief and the particular, careful hope of someone who has lost something and has not yet allowed themselves to believe they have gotten it back. "Zacharias," she said. "We do not have to resolve everything tonight," he said. "You need to sleep. You need a meal. You have a bruise under your eye that I would like to look at properly." "It is fine," she said. "I know you believe that," he said. "Let me look at it anyway." A pause, and then something that was almost a smile, the ghost of the expression he had been carrying in his memory for 3 years. "All right," she said. He got the small medical kit from the desk drawer, the one he kept for the occasional necessity of his work, and he sat beside her and examined the bruise with careful fingers, and she let him, which was its own kind of statement. The bruise was not serious. Some swelling and discoloration below the cheekbone where something or someone had made contact, and he cleaned it with a damp cloth and said nothing more about it, because she did not want him to, and he was good enough at reading her to know the difference. "The warrant," she said while he worked. "It is real. The territorial warrant, it is real," he said. "George arrived yesterday morning with it. He has been working with the Territorial Marshal's office for 6 months. The investigation has been ongoing longer than you might think. And the documents I took from the estate are in a safe in the Territorial Marshal's office in Topeka," he said. "You managed to get them out of the estate before they caught you. You dropped them over the wall and they were recovered by a man named Ellis who works for George and who has been watching the estate since March." She stared at him. "You knew," she said. "You knew I had been there." "George suspected it," he said. "When the documents arrived without attribution, and the specific nature of what they contained matched exactly what I had told him about your research over the years, he suspected. He sent me a telegram in January asking whether I thought my wife might be operating in the area." "January," she said. "That was 6 months ago." "Yes," he said. "You did not come looking for me. You did not want to be found," he said. "Or you would have told me where you were. I thought if you were safe, the best thing I could do was let you make the choice to come back or not." Another silence, and this one had a different quality altogether. It had the quality of 2 people looking at each other honestly, without performance or protection, which is a thing that does not happen easily between people who have hurt each other, even with the best of intentions. "I am sorry," she said. "I am genuinely and completely sorry for leaving the way I did. I have been sorry every day for 3 years." "I know," he said. "You forgive me," he looked at her. 3 years ago," he said, "I made a promise. I made it seriously in front of witnesses, and I have not stopped meaning it. Whatever happened in between, whatever choices were made for whatever reasons, I am still your husband and I would like very much to still be your husband. So yes, I forgive you, but you have to promise me something." "What?" she said. "No more solo missions," he said. "No more carrying the dangerous things alone. Whatever comes next with Grail and things are coming, we do it together. You bring it to me. We decide together." She looked at him for a long moment. "Agreed," she said. He put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand and held his. There was a long, quiet moment that was not really quiet at all because it was full of 3 years of missing each other, full of everything they had not said, and everything they had been afraid of, and everything they still wanted. And Zacharias sat in that moment and let it settle over him like something he had earned. "Come home," he said. She stood up and he stood with her, and they walked out of the office and down the dark street toward the house on Cotter Road. The territorial investigation moved quickly in the weeks that followed. George Alcott arrived in Dustfall with 2 men from the territorial marshal's office, and they set up operations in the courthouse and began the formal process of reviewing the documents Miriam had recovered and cross-referencing them with the county records and the original deed files, and the testimonies they gathered from families who had sold their land to Grail under what turned out to be various forms of coercion and fraud. Zacharias coordinated the local side of it, managing the witnesses and securing the physical sites and keeping the daily order of Dustfall, which was strained under the pressure of what was happening. Hector Grail was still free, still in the county, still commanding the loyalty of his hired men, and the weeks between the arrest warrant being filed and the formal proceedings beginning were the most tense weeks Dustfall had seen in years. Wren disappeared 3 days after the warrant was served. He simply left, horse and bags and all, in the early morning, and no one saw him go. Zacharias sent information to the territorial office, and 2 weeks later heard that Wren had been picked up in Missouri and was cooperating with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges, which was exactly what Zacharias had expected. Men like Wren were loyal to themselves first, and to whoever was paying them second, and when the payment became uncertain, the loyalty evaporated. Miriam returned to the schoolhouse. This was the thing that surprised him most, the speed and completeness with which she returned to her work. Within a week of coming back to Dustfall, she had walked through the door of the school on Cotter Road, assessed what had happened to the place in her absence, which was mostly a shortage of qualified instructors and a certain amount of organizational drift, and began putting it back together with the same methodical focus she brought to everything she did. The students adored her. The parents, some of whom had been quietly furious about her disappearance even while not understanding it, found themselves disarmed by her directness and her competence and her obvious genuine care for the children in her classroom. Zacharias watched this with a full heart. He watched her rebuild herself back into the fabric of Dustfall, and he understood that this was what she had needed: the work, the structure, the sense of contributing to something that was hers. She had been in motion for 3 years, moving from town to town, unable to put roots down because roots meant permanence and permanence meant risk. Coming back to Dustfall, back to the school, was an act of courage. He wanted her to know that he saw it as such. At dinner one evening, about 2 weeks after her return, he told her, "I want you to know that what you did, coming back here, walking back into that schoolroom, that took real courage." She looked up from her plate. "It is my school," she said. "It is yours," he agreed. "But it would have been easier to go somewhere new. You chose here." She was quiet for a moment. "I chose here because here is where you are," she said, with the particular directness she had when she was being honest about something she found difficult. "And because running away from things I love has cost me enough. I am not doing it again." He reached across the table and she gave him her hand. There were evenings, many of them in the months that followed, that Zacharias would remember as among the best of his life. Evenings when the investigation was going well and the town was quiet, and Miriam would sit across from him in the parlor with a book or her papers, and he would have his own work or sometimes nothing at all, and the lamp would burn between them and the night would be large and calm outside, and he would look at her over the rim of his reading and feel a gratitude so deep and simple that it was almost embarrassing. He told her about this once. "I feel embarrassingly grateful," he said, "for this, for you, for the specific plainness of this evening." She looked at him over her book with one of her looks that meant she was amused. "That is not embarrassing," she said. "That is being a person who knows what he has." "You feel it too?" he asked. She put the book down. "Every day," she said. "Every single ordinary day that we are here together and I have the school and you have the badge and the lamps are on. Yes, every day." Hector Grail was formally indicted in August of 1880. The charges were extensive: land fraud, deed forgery, arson, intimidation of witnesses, and bribery of public officials, including the county marshal, who had already been removed from his position and was facing his own separate proceedings. Grail was taken into custody by 2 territorial marshals and transported to Topeka for trial, and Dustfall watched the carriage carry him out of town with a feeling that was not quite celebration and not quite relief, but a mixture of both with a long, exhausted gratitude underneath it. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Zacharias testified on 2 days of it, presenting the investigative work of the previous years. Miriam testified for a full afternoon, presenting the documentation she had compiled, and Zacharias sat in the gallery and watched her be precise and clear and entirely unintimidated by the defense counsel's attempts to undermine her credibility. And he was so proud of her that he had to look at the ceiling periodically to maintain his own composure. Grail was convicted on all primary counts. He was sentenced to 14 years in the territorial prison. Douglas Wren received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation. The county marshal received 3 years. 11 other men connected to the operation received various charges and penalties. On the evening after the verdict was announced, Zacharias and Miriam stood on the porch of their house on Cotter Road and watched the sun go down over the plains, and did not say anything for a long time because everything that needed to be said was already present between them, in the way they were standing with their shoulders touching and her hand in his. "It is over," she finally said. "This part of it," he said. "What comes next?" she asked. He thought about it. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Dustfall needs rebuilding. The economy here was built around Grail's operation, and now that is gone. There will be a period of difficulty. New opportunities, people finding their way. The school will be important," she said. "The most important thing," he agreed. She leaned against him. "I want a life here," she said. "A real one, not just the work. A life." He put his arm around her. "Tell me what that looks like," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Children," she said, and then, checking herself, "if you want that too." "I want that very much," he said. "The house is too small," she said. "We can expand it," he said. "The school will need more staff," she said. "We can find more staff," he said. "You are agreeing with everything I say," she said. "Because everything you say is correct," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. "I love you," she said. "I need you to know that clearly. 3 years of not saying it does not diminish it. I love you, and I want to build the rest of our lives here." He looked at her in the fading light, and he thought that there was no moment in his life he had felt more like himself than this one. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since a Tuesday in a general store when you handed me 3 pages of evidence and looked at me like you were waiting to see if I was worth talking to." She laughed, which was a rare and particular sound, and he kissed her in the evening light on their small porch with the plains wide and patient around them. The rebuilding of Dustfall took years, as he had expected, but it was a good kind of work, the kind that leaves visible progress behind it. Without Grail's shadow over the land market, families who had been squeezed out returned, and families who had been waiting to put down roots did so. and the town grew in the quiet, organic way of a thing that is allowed to follow its own nature. New businesses opened. The school doubled in enrollment over 3 years, and Miriam hired 2 additional teachers, a young woman named Helen from St. Louis and a man named Peter who had come west from Ohio. The church expanded. The telegraph office upgraded its equipment and started carrying the Associated Press wire, bringing the wider world into Dust Fall's daily conversation. Zacharias was reappointed as sheriff in 1881, and again in 1883, and again in 1885. He was good at his work, and the town knew it, and they expressed their knowing in the tangible currency of continued trust. He hired 2 deputies over those years, men he trained himself in the Cassius Ford School of Building Law carefully and daily, and Dust Fall's relationship with violence remained manageable and occasional rather than endemic. Their son was born in October of 1881. He arrived on a Sunday morning in a rapid and completely uncooperative fashion that gave Zacharias a terror more acute than any confrontation with an armed man had ever produced, and was greeted with a relief and a joy that Zacharias had not known he was capable of feeling until he held the boy in his arms and heard him cry and understood that the world had just expanded in a direction he had not been able to imagine. They named him Ellis, for the man who had recovered Miriam's documents from the wall of the Grail estate, and because Miriam liked the plainness of it. Ellis Lorne was a healthy, opinionated, perpetually curious child who appeared to have received his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, and who began making his opinions known at an age that suggested the combination was going to be a challenge. He pulled himself upright at 8 months. He was walking at 10. He was conducting what could only be described as arguments at 12, though the vocabulary was not yet sufficient to fully support his evident ambitions. Miriam watched him with undisguised delight. "He is exactly like you," Zacharias told her. "He is exactly like both of us," she corrected. "He has your eyes and my relentlessness." "That combination is going to be someone else's problem very shortly," he said. "He is 2 years old," she said. "I know," he said. "I am projecting." She laughed. Their daughter was born in 1884. She arrived in a manner that was much more orderly than her brother's entrance and was named Clara, which Miriam had suggested, and Zacharias had accepted with a complicated emotion that Miriam had read immediately, and she had taken his hand and said, "The name belongs to good things too. Let it belong to this." He had let it belong to this. Clara Lorne was a quieter child than her brother, deeply observant with her father's gray eyes and her mother's habit of taking in information before offering any of her own back. She watched the world with a careful thoroughness that made both her parents feel slightly that they were being evaluated. She adored Ellis with a possessiveness that expressed itself primarily in following him everywhere he went and objecting loudly when he went anywhere without her. The 4 of them lived in the house on Cotter Road, which had been expanded twice, once to accommodate Ellis, and once to accommodate Clara and a proper kitchen, and a second parlor that served as Miriam's study and occasionally as an informal meeting place for school business. The house had grown into itself over the years, accumulated the evidence of a life being lived with purpose and warmth, and Zacharias felt the truth of it every time he came home to it. In 1885, Miriam was appointed to the county school board, the first woman in 4 counties to hold such a position, and she applied herself to the political dimensions of the role with the same systematic precision she had always brought to everything, and within 2 years had substantially altered the material and pedagogical standards for every school in the county. She made enemies doing it, because improvement at scale requires displacing the people who have benefited from the status quo, and she was neither surprised by the enemies nor troubled by them. Zacharias watched her navigate the board politics the way she had once navigated Grail's shadow over Dustfall, with patience and precision, and a fundamental unwillingness to be intimidated. "You are remarkable," he told her one evening after a particularly complex board meeting from which she had returned with the look of a woman who had won something difficult. She sat down and accepted the cup of tea he brought her and looked at him. "You say that with great regularity," she said. "It is regularly true," he said. "You are not without your own qualities," she said, with the dry affection that was one of her particular languages. "Thank you," he said. "I am deeply glad to hear it." She smiled at him. In the autumn of 1886, there was a letter from Hector Grail. It arrived through his lawyer, a formal legal document, and its contents were a request for early release on grounds of deteriorating health. Zacharias read it carefully, noted that Grail had served 6 of his 14 years, and wrote a response that was thoroughly documented and entirely clear about his position, which was that 6 years did not satisfy the scope of what had been done to the families on the northern border, and that he would be opposing the release request and was prepared to provide testimony to that effect. He showed the letter and his response to Miriam. She read both. "The Calloway family," she said. "They should know about this." "I was going to ride to their new place next week," he said. "They settled in the Osage County area, if you recall." "I recall," she said. "Take me with you." "Of course," he said. They rode to Osage County together, leaving Ellis and Clara with Helen from the schoolhouse, who had become their most trusted childminder, and they visited the Calloway family, who had rebuilt themselves on good land and were doing well, and they sat in the Calloway kitchen and talked about the request and what it meant and what they intended to do about it. The Calloways were clear and firm. They wanted their testimony on record. They wanted their voices in the process. Zacharias made sure those voices were heard. The release request was denied. Grail served his full sentence, which was reduced from 14 years to 12 on standard grounds, and was released in 1892, at which point he was 64 years old, broken in health, and possessed of an empire that had been substantially dismantled and distributed back to its rightful owners through the territorial land court proceedings. He moved to Colorado and died 3 years later of a heart condition that the local newspaper noted as unremarkable. Wren was never heard from in Kansas again. The Dustfall of 1886 and the Dustfall of 1879 were different towns in almost every meaningful way, and Zacharias watched the difference accumulate the way a man watches a house being built, day by day, not dramatic. But then one morning you look up and there it is, standing in the light, complete and solid. He was 42 years old in 1892, with gray threading into his dark hair, and the particular settled quality of a man who has been doing meaningful work for a long time and knows it. His face was more lined than it had been when he arrived in Dustfall, but the eyes were the same, gray and patient and alert, and his hands were steady, and his word was still the most reliable currency in the county. Miriam was 39. And she had become in the years since their reunion something that was very much herself, and also more than the young schoolteacher who had handed him 3 pages of evidence in a general store. She had grown into the full scale of what she was, a woman of significant intelligence and significant will, whose work had shaped not just Dustfall, but the broader county in ways that would outlast either of them. She was still direct, and still serious, and still capable of the dry, particular humor that had always been part of her. And she was still most fully herself in the evenings in their parlor with her work spread around her. except that now the evenings also had a 12-year-old boy doing his own homework at the other end of the table, and an 8-year-old girl curled in the armchair with a book, and the lamp burned warm over all of them. This was the life, this specific, ordinary, extraordinary life. Ellis was going to be tall. It was clear by 1892, and he had developed a passion for mathematics that surprised both his parents and delighted his mother, and suggested, she said, that he might make a good engineer or a very tiresome accountant, and she said it with the warmth of someone who would be proud of him either way. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's cheekbones, and was in the middle of the awkward transition between boy and young man with the predictable amount of self-consciousness about it, which his father found entirely sympathetic and his mother found entirely interesting. Clara was quieter and more interior, reading everything she could find, asking questions that were too precise for an 8-year-old, but entirely characteristic of a girl raised in a house where precision was the dominant intellectual mode. She wanted to know, one evening at dinner, exactly how the law worked and whether a sheriff could be wrong and whether being wrong had consequences and what they were. Zacharias answered her honestly and thoroughly. Miriam watched from across the table with an expression that Zacharias had come to read as her particular form of joy, the contained, present, specific joy of watching her children be themselves. After the children were in bed that evening, Zacharias sat in the parlor and said to Miriam, who was at her desk with the school board reports, "Clara is going to be something extraordinary." "She already is," Miriam said without looking up. "You know what she wants to be." "She told me last week, but I am not certain I heard correctly." "A judge," Miriam said. Zacharias thought about this. "It is 1892, he said. "I know," Miriam said. "I also know that it will not always be 1892. And I know that if Clara Lorne decides she is going to be a judge, there is not a force in the territory capable of stopping her." He thought about his daughter sitting across from him at dinner with her precise, earnest eyes, asking about how the law works. "No," he agreed. "There is not." In 1893, the territorial government reorganized the county boundaries and Dustfall was elevated to county seat status, which brought with it increased administrative complexity, and a new courthouse, and a significant uptick in the formal legal business of the region. Zacharias worked with the new county commissioners to establish an expanded law enforcement structure, including a formal marshal's department separate from the sheriffing operation. And this restructuring occupied the better part of a year and was finished well, and to the satisfaction of most people involved. Miriam resigned from the school board that year to take a position as a district school superintendent, which was a larger stage and a more complex one, and exactly the kind of challenge she thrived on. She hired Helen to run the Cotter Road School and spent the following years traveling the district and raising standards and fighting the particular bureaucratic fights that are required of anyone who wants to change a system from within rather than from outside. She was extraordinary at it. He told her so regularly, because it was regularly true, and because she needed to hear it the same way that anyone who does difficult work needs to hear it, regardless of how self-possessed they appear. One evening, with the children asleep and the house quiet around them, she put down her work and looked at him. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said. "Tell me," he said. "That night at the edge of town," she said, "when you came through the crowd and you said what you said." "She is my wife," he said. "Yes," she said. "You had not seen me in 3 years. I had left without a word. I had complicated your life in every imaginable way, and you came through that crowd and you claimed me in front of everyone." "Of course I did," he said. "It was not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It changed everything," she said. You said it would and you were right. It changed everything." He looked at her. "I would do it again," he said, "under any circumstances. Whatever came before and whatever came after, I would always choose you." She got up from her chair and came across the room to him and sat beside him on the small sofa, close enough that their arms touched, and she leaned against him the way she had stood against him on the porch the evening after the verdict, the particular leaning of a woman who is finally, fully home. "I know," she said. "That is what I think about, that I am with a man who would always choose me." He put his arm around her. "And I am with a woman who would walk into a locked estate at night to fight injustice," he said. "With a hairpin," she said. "With a hairpin," he confirmed. "Which I maintain was the most dangerous and impressive thing anyone has ever done in the history of this county." She laughed. He held her in the quiet parlor and listened to the house around them, the settling of the wood and the faint night wind outside, and the comfortable sounds of a life that had been built over many years of honest labor and real love. In 1895, Ellis went to the university in Lawrence to study engineering. He was 15 and tall and terrifyingly competent, and Zacharias drove him to the train station in the wagon with Miriam beside him and Clara sitting in the back, and the parting was handled by everyone with great dignity. And then Zacharias had to wait until the train was gone before he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his son's absence, which hit him somewhere in the chest with the particular grief of something being exactly right. Miriam held his hand on the drive back. "He will come back for summer," she said. "I know," he said. "He will write," she said. "Every week," he agreed, because he knew his son. "He will be extraordinary," she said. "He already is," Zacharias said, which was exactly what she had said about Clara, and both of them knew it. Ellis wrote every week. He came back in summer, and was slightly taller and slightly more certain of himself, and still capable of arguing at breakfast for an hour about engineering principles or mathematics, in a way that made Miriam look at Zacharias over the table with the expression that meant exactly what it always had. Clara was 12 in 1896 and was reading law books. Zacharias had found her one morning at the kitchen table with a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries that she had borrowed from the district court library, working her way through it with the systematic focus of someone who had decided to understand something completely. He sat down across from her. "What do you understand so far?" he asked. She looked up and explained clearly and correctly the concept of common law precedent. He was quiet for a moment. "You want me to find more books?" he asked. "Yes, please," she said, and went back to reading. He spoke to George Alcott, who was still in Abilene and still practicing, and George sent a box of legal texts with a note that said he was entirely unsurprised and entirely delighted, and that Clara should write to him when she was ready to discuss them. She wrote to him 6 weeks later. They corresponded regularly for the next 4 years. In 1898, Kansas was 20 years past the wildest of its Wild West years, and Dustfall had become a proper town in the fullest sense, with paved sections of Main Street, and a new schoolhouse that could accommodate 80 students and a courthouse that served the county with considerable dignity. The old days of Grail's shadow and the constant friction of an ungoverned landscape had passed into local history, the kind of history that people tell carefully and with a certain pride about having survived it. Zacharias was 58 years old, and considering whether the time had come to step back from the sheriff's position and let a younger man carry it. He was not diminished in any essential way. His eyes were still sharp, and his instincts were still reliable. But he had begun to feel the shape of the next part of his life, which was less about the daily management of order and more about the larger work of the town's long future. He talked to Miriam about it. She listened with her customary attention and then said, "What would you do with yourself?" "Help you," he said. "With the district work. There is more of it than you can do alone, and I have 17 years of relationships in this county that are useful." She considered this. "You would not find it diminishing?" she asked. "After everything you have been?" "After everything I have been," he said. "What I want is to work beside you. If that is what the next part looks like, I consider myself fortunate." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "But you resign formally. You make sure the man who takes the badge is the right man." "I have been training him for 2 years," Zacharias said. She smiled. He resigned as sheriff of Dustfall County in the autumn of 1898, and the badge went to his deputy, a man named Thomas Harrigan, who had come to Dustfall at 24 and learned the work in the Zacharias Lorne School of building it daily and carefully. The town turned out for the formal ceremony, and there were speeches and a dinner at the hotel, and Miriam stood beside Zacharias throughout it with her hand in his and her head held in that way she had, straight and clear and entirely present. After the dinner, walking home under a sky that was enormous with stars, Clara, who was 14, walked on Zacharias's left side and said, "Are you sad?" He thought about it honestly. "Not sad," he said. "Ready?" "For what comes next?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "What comes next?" she asked. Miriam, on his right, said, "That is the interesting part." What came next included, over the following years, Zacharias serving on the county commission and contributing materially to the reorganization of the regional road system and the establishment of a county library, which was Miriam's project, and which she built from a donation of books and a determination, and a space above the hardware store that she cleaned and furnished and opened herself. What came next included Clara going to Lawrence for school at 16, armed with 4 years of Blackstone and the George Alcott correspondence, and a certainty about her direction that was absolute and unignorable, and Ellis completing his engineering degree and returning to Kansas to work on the expanding railway network. What came next included evenings on the porch of the Cotter Road house, expanded now to 2 stories, and a proper garden, with the plains wide and peaceful in the evening light. What came next included, in the spring of 1900, Ellis bringing home a young woman named Frances from Lawrence, the daughter of a physician, who had eyes that were perpetually amused and hands that were perpetually covered in charcoal from her artwork, and who shook Miriam's hand with a firmness that Miriam approved of immediately and laughed at one of Ellis's jokes in a way that suggested she saw through him entirely and liked what she saw anyway. They were married the following autumn in Dustfall, in the church on Maple Street, where Zacharias and Miriam had married 21 years earlier, and the wedding was large and warm and entirely too long, and Zacharias spent a considerable portion of it watching Miriam watch their son, and thinking that happiness of this specific, layered, accumulated kind was something that took a long time to build and was worth every day of the building. On the Sunday before Christmas of 1901, Zacharias came in from the yard to find Miriam at her desk with a letter that she had clearly read several times. "What is it?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, and her face had a quality he had not seen in many years, the quality of someone receiving news they had been expecting but were not fully prepared for. "George Alcott died," she said. "On Wednesday. His daughter wrote to me." Zacharias sat down. George Alcott had been 67, not an extraordinary age but not a young one, and he had been less well for the past 2 years. The news was not surprising. It was still loss. "He was a good man," Zacharias said. "He was an excellent man," Miriam said. "He fought for things that needed fighting for when it was not convenient or safe to do so." "He helped save your life," Zacharias said. "He helped save a great many things," she said. They were quiet for a moment. Then Miriam said, "Clara wrote last week. She asked whether George's old practice might become available. She is looking toward Abilene as a place to establish." "Is she qualified yet?" Zacharias asked. "Nearly," Miriam said. "She says within the year." "A female lawyer practicing in Abilene in 1902, Zacharias said. "Yes," Miriam said, with the tone that meant she had thought about this carefully and her conclusion was unchanged. "Remarkable," he said. "She is our daughter," Miriam said. He reached out and took her hand across the desk, and she turned her hand and held his. In the spring of 1902, Clara sent a letter that she was moving to Abilene to join an established practice, and that her first case was a land dispute on behalf of a family of settlers, and that she was prepared and certain. In the autumn of 1902, Ellis and Frances had their first child, a boy they named John, which was simple and solid and entirely characteristic of Ellis. All of this difficulty and love and work. We built all of this. John was a healthy, loud, opinionated child who appeared to have received Ellis's curiosity and Frances's perpetual amusement in a combination that was going to be extremely difficult to manage in about 18 months. Frances was already expecting their second child. That child, a girl named Miriam, arrived in June of 1903, and no one could pretend that the name was coincidental. And Miriam the elder received the news with a dignity that was entirely transparent and went very quiet for about 10 seconds before she said, "She had better be difficult then, or the name will be wasted." Frances, reporting this by letter, wrote that she and Ellis were confident that the name would not be wasted. In the spring of 1904, Zacharias was standing on the porch of the Cotter Road house in the early morning with his coffee when Miriam came out and stood beside him. The plains were pale gold in the new light, and the town below them was just beginning its day, the thin sounds of morning activity rising from Main Street. 25 years, she said. He thought about it. April, he said. 25 years in April. "I want to do something for it," she said. "What would you like?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I would like everyone to come here," she said. "Ellis and Frances and the children, Clara if she can manage it, all of it here in this house." "I will write them today," he said. "And I would like," she said, and then paused, and he looked at her. She was looking at the plains. "I would like you to take me back to the edge of town," she said. "Where it happened, where you said it." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. In the second week of April 1904, with the spring wide open and warm around them, the family gathered in the house on Cotter Road. Ellis arrived from Lawrence with Frances and John, now 2 years old and entirely too fast on his feet, and the baby Miriam, who was less a baby than the name implied by this point, and considerably more opinionated than a 10-month-old had any right to be. Clara arrived from Abilene by train with a briefcase full of papers and the permanent impression of having been working for approximately 18 hours straight, which was probably accurate, and she shed the briefcase at the door and picked up her nephew and was immediately a different person, warmer and lighter, the part of herself she kept for family. The house was full and loud and perfect. On the anniversary morning, Zacharias and Miriam rose early and dressed and slipped out while the house still slept. They walked down Cotter Road and along the edge of Main Street in the early morning stillness, and out to the northern edge of town where the road narrowed and the buildings gave way to open land. They stood there. It was quieter than it had been that night. There were no crowds, no lanterns, no ropes or guns or watching eyes. There was only the morning, pale and clear, and the town behind them and the plains before them, and 25 years between this moment and the last time they had stood at this edge. "It was here," she said. It was here, he confirmed. She was looking out at the road where Grail's men had stood with their lanterns and their certainty that they were untouchable. I was so afraid, she said. Not for myself, for you. I was standing there thinking that you were going to do something that would make you a target, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was not thinking about targets, he said. I know, she said. You were thinking about me. I was thinking about you, he said. And about the fact that everything I had built for 7 years, and every reason I had for doing it, was standing in the middle of that road with her wrists bound. She turned and looked at him. He looked back at her. 25 years. 2 children grown and building lives of their own. 2 grandchildren sleeping in the house at the top of the road. A town rebuilt from fear and fraud into something solid and alive and good. A marriage that had nearly been lost and had been found again and had been held carefully ever since. She is my wife, he said quietly, just for her. And that changes everything. Her eyes were bright. It did, she said. It changed everything. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the same way he had done the first winter they were married, when her hair was loose against her shoulder in the kitchen light, and she leaned into his hand the way she always had. I would do it again, he said. I know, she said. And I would go back and tell you what I was planning instead of going alone. I would do it differently. We did it the way we did it, he said. We got here. We got here, she agreed. She took his arm and they turned together and walked back toward the town, toward the house full of family, toward the morning that was widening over the Kansas plains, warm and golden and without reservation. Behind them, the edge of town was quiet, an ordinary stretch of road in an ordinary spring morning, and nothing about it would have told a stranger about the night that had changed everything. But they carried it with them, not as a wound or a weight, but as a part of the story, the dark thread without which the rest of the pattern would not have held, the moment of the highest stakes from which everything good had grown. Dustfall was fully awake by the time they reached Main Street. Percy Finch's son, who had taken over the general store, was opening the shutters, and Thomas Harrigan was walking his morning circuit in the badge that had once been Zacharias's. And the school on Cotter Road had smoke coming from its chimney where Helen, 25 years a teacher there now, was warming the room for the day's students. Miriam looked at it. All of this, she said. All of this, he agreed. The school started it, she said. Coming here for the teaching position. If I had not needed the work, I would not have come to Dustfall. If I had not needed a purpose, I would not have come either, he said. We found each other at the intersection of our necessities, she said, with the particular dry precision that was one of her languages of love. That is the most Miriam Voss sentence ever spoken, he said. Voss Lorne, she said, using the hyphen she had adopted quietly about 10 years into the marriage without making any announcement about it, which was entirely characteristic. Voss Lorne, he conceded. At the house, Ellis was standing on the porch with coffee, young John on his hip eating a piece of bread with great dedication, and he watched his parents coming up the road together in the morning light. You were out early, he said. We had somewhere to be, Miriam said, taking her grandchild from her son's arms with the ease of practice. She held John and looked at him, and he looked back at her with his father's serious eyes and then offered her the bread. Thank you, she said, accepting a bite with great solemnity. Zacharias put his hand on Ellis's shoulder as they went inside, and Ellis, 22 years old and a foot taller than his father, and building the future of the territory 1 railway mile at a time, put his hand briefly over his father's, and that was the whole of what needed to be said. Inside, Francis was at the kitchen stove and Clara was at the table with the baby Miriam, who had developed opinions about Clara's breakfast, and was expressing them with the force of someone who had inherited the family talent for relentlessness. and the house was warm and full of sound. And Zacharias stood in the doorway for a moment, and let it reach him, all of it, the sound and the warmth and the particular, ordinary, extraordinary grace of this life. Miriam came to stand beside him with John on her hip. "Come in," she said, "or there will be nothing left." He came in. The table was full and loud, and the coffee was strong, and the morning was long and good. And outside the Kansas spring was continuing without rush or reservation. And the town of Dustfall was building its day in the way that towns do, when they have been given the chance to become themselves, one morning at a time, each one opening into the next like a door into a room that is always warmer than the one before. They stayed at the table for a long time. They had earned the staying,